Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name, as he said, is Jeff Hummel, and let's get started with my presentation. Oh, we'll just do it this way. So I'm going to cover a little bit of background about the ship. I'm going to talk about the Cassiar gold rush, which is a gold rush that probably none of you have ever heard of. Geographically and chronologically, it's between the California gold rush and the Alaska gold rush. I'm going to talk about the gold trade in British Columbia and basically how the mechanics of moving gold around was going on at the time period with the merchants. I'm going to talk a little bit about the last journey of the Pacific, and I'll talk about our discovery of the ship in late 2021 and our confirmation of the ship in 2022. We'll talk about the placer gold, the gold bars, and the gold coins that are on board the ships, and then are on board the ship, and then we'll do a question and answer at the end. So basically, how do you get into the field of shipwreck hunting? And for me, it started when I was in the third grade. My dad told me that there were World War II airplanes in Lake Washington. I grew up on an island right adjacent to Seattle. It's between Seattle and Bellevue. And so I thought, one of those days, I'm going to go get one of those airplanes. I watched John Wayne movies when I was growing up, and I thought that would be a great idea to go get one of those planes. So in high school, I learned how to scuba dive. I kept the dream alive, and we located the airplane using side scan sonar, and we found an airplane that didn't have an engine in it. And so we thought, well, it probably didn't belong to the Navy anymore because it didn't crash. It had obviously been abandoned. So we salvaged the airplane, and then I promptly got sued by the United States government. So I was a freshman at the University of Washington, and I was in a landmark case called United States versus Hummel et al. And you never really want to have that situation where you're being sued by the Navy. So the Navy had a whole team of lawyers. They had a lawyer and a team of lawyers in Seattle. They had one in San Francisco. They had one in Washington, D.C. They had all the resources. I was investigated by the FBI. Later, people saw my FBI file. And really, I was up against John Lehman, the Secretary of the Navy. He wanted that airplane to stay a Navy possession. And you can sort of see the airplane there in the background. That's me leaning. That's the younger version of me. Leaning against the airplane, the remains of the airplane. And calling it an airplane is kind of a stretch. It was a chunk of airplane, but it was a very important piece of airplane. So after we won the court case, we were approached by a collector, just like there's coin collectors, there are airplane collectors. And this collector had found this pile of junk up in the mountains of Utah, and while he was deer hunting, he discovered it was a Curtiss Helldiver. And miraculously, the serial number of this airplane was within 150 of our airplane. And so the airplanes were virtually identical in a run of like 8,000 airplanes. So he thought he could combine the parts that he had, that stuff, with what we brought up, which looked different but equally as bad, and turn it into an airplane. And I remember asking him as he drove away with the airplane how long it was going to take him. And he thought it would take him 20 years. He was off by half. It took him 40 years. And the airplane flew for the very first time last August, and it is one of 3 flying Curtiss Helldivers in the world. So that is the airplane today. I went and saw it about 2 years ago, and it's absolutely been beautifully restored by just an amazing team in Colorado. So the finding the airplane led to some opportunities, I majored in product design at the University of Washington. I worked for a company that built underwater robotics equipment. I was kind of exposed to it when I was working on the project and thought, that was an interesting field. I couldn't really figure out how to make any money at it, so I kind of moved on from that. So I transitioned to GPS and electronic navigation systems. And I worked for 2 startups, which became the leaders in their field. I've testified at the United Nations on behalf of the U.S. government on electronic navigation issues. So I've been heavily involved in that particular industry. If you've ever used like a Garmin electronic navigation system for your boat, you've been exposed to technology that I helped create. So after that, I thought, great, this is interesting, airplanes, but I want something maybe that's a little more valuable. So I started looking around for other projects, and there's a great history book on the Northwest that had a little blurb about the Pacific, and that's when I first became exposed to it. And so, I started doing research. I was on the debate team when I was in high school, And I thought, I'll go do some research. I actually owned a medical supply company at the time. I was traveling around the country, and so I go to various archives and, learn about things about the Pacific. So I spent time in New York and Washington, D.C., and San Francisco and British Columbia. And eventually, this is way before the internet, and so eventually I gathered enough historical documents to determine that the Pacific, was an interesting shipwreck to pursue. So this here is a serograph of the Pacific that was done shortly after it was launched. It looks really interesting and accurate, but over time I've discovered that there's a lot of inaccuracies in that photo. So basically the story of the loss is the Pacific departed from Victoria, British Columbia on November 4th, 1875. It sank with a collision with a sailing vessel that was going the opposite direction up the coast. On the sailing vessel, they mistook the masthead light of the Pacific as the Cape Flattery light. They turned broadside to turn offshore, and the Pacific T-boned it, just embedded the bow of the Pacific right into the side of the ship. They separated, the sailing vessel went sailing off into the night, and the Pacific was mortally wounded and sank about 25 minutes later. There were only 2 survivors of the 400 plus people on board. We don't really know how many people are on board. I have a list of about 300 and plus people, but there were many people who were just never recorded, and so no one really knows. There's an author later claimed that there were 500 people on board, but there was a large number of people on board. There were 2 survivors, and miraculously the granddaughter of one of the survivors is still alive. She's 93 years old and lives in Stillicum. I spent some time with her, which is kind of amazing part of the story, a personal connection to the actual story. So the story of the Pacific has a lot of legs. There's some really interesting aspects of it. This photo that you see on the screen right now is actually a photo that was taken by Edward Muybridge. And Edward Muybridge is the person who is considered to be the creator of the motion picture camera. So he's the one who took the famous picture of the horse galloping and to see if all of the feet of the horse were off the ground at the same time. Well, in 1868, he took passage on the Pacific to southeast Alaska after the purchase of McKinley's Folly, which was Alaska. And he went on a team, sponsored by Congress to go document it. And he happened to take a number of pictures of the Pacific, including this one. And I love this photo because this is the wake of the Pacific. And if you kind of look at it, you can sort of see, it's a side wheel steamer. You can sort of see the paddle marks, in the wake of the ship. And I just love that photo for that reason. The captain of the ship was the brother-in-law to Jefferson Davis. He was quite a bit younger than Jefferson Davis. He went to the Naval Academy and was an interesting character. He was promoted to the captain of the ship after he led the rescue team on a different shipwreck called the SS Brother Jonathan, which sank off of Crescent City. And so he and part of the crew went ashore and hiked overland 7 miles to Crescent City, got the rescue team together, and they rescued the people from the Brother Jonathan. Another interesting part of the story is that there was a woman on board, young woman, socialite from Victoria, British Columbia, named Fanny Palmer, and she was, always the belle of the ball. She was the daughter of the professor there in Victoria, and she dated a guy named John Tunstall, and John Tunstall, of course, is the key character in the story of Billy the Kid. And had the Pacific not sunk, the story of Billy the Kid wouldn't exist because Tunstall would not have left under the circumstances that he did. So after Fanny, sailed away on the ship, they had broken up, and she sailed away on the ship and perished. He felt so bad, he moved to San Francisco, and eventually he moved to Lincoln County, New Mexico, and we know the rest of the story from there. The story of the discovery of the gold field also has a lot of legs. People have never heard of the Cassiar gold rush, and the discovery was by a guy named Henry Thibault, and he had traveled from Montreal across Canada. He left in 1869 when the Hudson's Bay Company lost their exclusive license to what's called Rupert's Land, which is the drainage of the Hudson's Bay. And so people speculated that the Hudson's Bay was interested in furs, not so much interested in gold, and there must be some gold up there. And so Thibault went up there with a guy named Nohingus, and they trudged around for about 2 years, didn't find anything. Eventually, Thibault hooked up with another guy named McCullough, and the two of them moved westward and eventually found the Cassiar gold field. McCullough actually perished on the way back to the gold field. He never knew that his partner had made the gold strike that he did, and he was literally a person who was obsessed with finding a new gold discovery. He was a kind of leftover from the California gold rush. So this is the location of the Cassiar. It's basically due east of Wrangell, Alaska. It's about 300 miles inland. There's a passage you can take up the Stickeen River that gets you there. It wasn't really until 1872 that they discovered gold there. Our ship sank in 1875, which was the peak year of production for that gold field. The gold field really survived until like about the 1930s. I think there's still people up there mining small amounts of gold. But I said the peak was in 1875. In 1874, I think there was about 3,500 people or so working in the gold field. So the gold was in a number of rivers, and the original claim owners who showed up first were the ones who did the best, and then they would hire day laborers, and the day laborers were making $10 to $20 a day, and it depended on whether you worked in the river if you were wet, or whether you were working on land, depending on how you got paid. There was very limited means of transporting the gold from the Cassiar. It was a very difficult passage. It involved transporting it down the lake and then 100 miles overland to the Stickeen River, from there to Wrangell, and then from Wrangell to Victoria. And a number of people attempted to make some sort of organized gold transport out of the gold field, but never really worked out. And so a lot of the miners ended up staying in the gold fields because in 1874 there had been a large number of mining disputes from claim jumping. So guys would go out prospecting, they'd come back, and there'd be someone working their original claim. And so a lot of the very successful miners, stayed in the field to protect their interest. So this is gold production for British Columbia, and you can see here that it peaked out in 1875. I think it was a number of years later that it, again reached the same height. So by strange coincidence, about 25% of the gold from that year ended up on this one particular ship. And that wasn't really that unusual. If you look at the records from 1874, the same thing happened where there was just one ship that happened to line up with the arrival of all of the miners in Victoria and their departure for San Francisco. So Victoria was a fairly small place. You've come back from the gold fields, all the depravity in the gold fields, and you've got all this money and there's nothing to do with it. So what do you want to do? You want to get to San Francisco as soon as you can. And that's what they did. So it was kind of interesting, doing the research on this and learning kind of how the gold flowed from the field, with the miners. There was some amount of transport between Cassiar and Wrangell, but that was mostly with the merchants, people bringing stuff up to the gold fields, getting paid in gold dust, bringing it back to Wrangell. There was also another, long-standing gold rush that was going on called the Caribou District, which really started in 1858. And so the merchants, accepted coarse gold at a discount. They usually bought the gold between about $16.50 an ounce to $17 an ounce. The gold from the Cassiar had a very high gold content. The secondary mineral in it was silver. So merchants had the gold assayed, and once it was assayed, it was marked with a value, and then that value was treated as currency in San Francisco. So, goods are flowing northward on the steamships, and gold is flowing southward, on the same steamships, and payment was made, with these gold bars. Some amount of gold coins were flowing southward as well, but I think we estimated that that's less than 10% of the value that was going southward was in coins. They had some pretty clever mechanisms set up with Wells Fargo, where they would, buy gold at discount. If you paid an invoice in Victoria in gold coins, then they would pay that same invoice for you at no charge in San Francisco, and it's because they wanted to have the gold coins so that they could then use those coins to buy gold for miners at a discount, and then work the difference between that and having it produced into coins in San Francisco. So there was a lot of clever sort of manipulations of the marketplace, so guys could make money on the transport of gold southward. So this is an advertisement for Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo originally had a bank in Victoria that was founded in about 1860, and when Garesche took over, Francis Garesche took over, he kept the bank going, and so it was Wells Fargo acting as an agent. They bought and sold gold. I found some documents that showed that the cost basically of shipping your gold from Victoria to San Francisco and back was about 5%, and that included all the insurance costs and shipping and that sort of thing. So one thing, of course, of great interest is what sort of coins are on board the ship, and who was dealing with coins and how many coins were just sort of around. And there were two chartered banks in Victoria at the time. One was the Bank of British Columbia, and the other one's the Bank of British North America. As charter banks, they could also issue notes, and because they issued notes, they were required to publish their assets in the newspaper quarterly. And so from those quarterly reports, we get the number of coins that they had on hand, and you can see. Actually, no, this isn't one of the documents, but we have documents that basically list how many coins that they had. And I think I have that in a table later in the presentation. So when Wells Fargo shipped the gold southward, they were shipping gold that belonged to certain merchants and belonged to the banks, and they always insured it. So in 1858, during the Caribou Gold Rush, there was a situation where people thought maybe that the gold rush was coming to an end, and people were like, "Well, wait a minute, that's not true." So maybe what we should do is we should publish the gold shipments that are going southward in the newspaper, every time a shipment goes out. And so they started doing that, and that's how we get the amounts of gold that were sent on every single ship. So those gold shipments were insured, and in the process of getting the legal rights to recover the cargo from the ship, we entered into an agreement with the underwriters, and part of that led to them providing us with documentation of what they had. And so we had a number of statements from the underwriter's loss. One of them, 1,500 pounds of treasure shipped on the Pacific, a loss of 2952 lost on the Pacific, another one, 1,500 in specie. The exchange rate back then was one Great Britain pound was worth about $5.59. So these were significant losses. My suspicion is that what they're talking about here is mostly gold bars, and I think that these were gold bars that they paid out on. Their records are not complete. We just have the total amount and then those specific records. So in the fall of 1875, a lot of miners said, okay, this is kind of playing out. I'm going to take my money now and I'm going to go to San Francisco. So they teamed up with the gold commissioner and a bunch of miners banded together. They've got to transport their gold over 300 miles through the wilderness and do it somehow safely. There were individuals in that group that had over 600 pounds of gold, and you can imagine the difficulty of moving that around. They didn't have a lot of horses. There were some pack trains and stuff like that, but it was a very difficult undertaking. But they all grouped together and came out. And the Wells Fargo agent met them in Wrangell, Alaska, and this was the first time that he had done that. Now, the Wells Fargo agent, it was a guy named Francis Garesche, and he had originally started out in Aurora, Nevada in the 1860s. And when the gold and silver played out there, he headed north and took over in Victoria, and he had lost out the market to a company called Bernard's Express, which was servicing the Caribou district. And so I think when this gold rush came along, he's like, aha, this is a good opportunity for me to make some more money in the transport of gold, from the gold fields. So he worked out an arrangement with the miners to go up to Wrangell and help escort their gold to the mint in San Francisco and help provide protection. So after we announced that we had discovered the ship, we had a number of people come forward and say that they were the descendants of people who had perished on the ship. And several of the people that came forward said that they were the descendants of people who were on board the ship to protect the gold. And I thought that was an interesting thing. So we suspected those people were on board, but we had no direct proof of that. But here it is, these people, the descendants of those people reached out to us. So the U.S. Mint was the destination for a lot of the gold that was on board the ship. They charged about 0.5% to produce coins they didn't produce, charge anything for the minting of the coins, but it was basically the refinement of the gold. And for the gold miners, that was the least expensive way to convert your gold into coins. So a little bit more on kind of the last journey of the Pacific. They collided with the Orpheus. It was T-boned, and when the Orpheus sailed away, they didn't think the Pacific had been fatally injured. And the Orpheus sailed away, and it actually sank the next day, not due to this incident, a completely separate incident. They basically didn't realize that there was a new lighthouse, and they sailed around the lighthouse that they saw, which was the wrong lighthouse, and then they sailed into Barkley Sound thinking they were going into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and they ran aground, and the ship sank. The captain was tried for barratry. They thought that he'd done it intentionally, but he was actually found not guilty on that. So the ship was incredibly difficult to find. So some of you guys are probably familiar with Odyssey Marine Exploration. Odyssey searched for the ship on 2 different expeditions in '99 and in 2001. A number of other people had looked for the ship, Oceaneering, a bunch of other companies. And it was extremely difficult to find because it doesn't present itself the way a lot of these other shipwrecks have. The ship is in between 1,000 and 2,000 feet of water, so unlike the Central America, which was in 8,000 feet of water, it's shallower, easier to recover. I mentioned this before, we've been granted exclusive salvage rights in U.S. Federal District Court. We have an agreement with the underwriters, and then we also secured rights to the ship itself, which is unusual. So we tracked down the successor owners of the ship, and they assigned the rights of the ship to ourselves. So we actually own the entire ship of the Pacific. So our approach to the recovery is that we're relying on experts that you guys probably know the names of. So Bob Evans is our chief scientist. He was the chief scientist on the Central America project. Ernie Tepenis, probably a name people aren't as familiar with, but he was in charge of recovering the coins from the SS Republic. One of the other people that we worked with, so after I salvaged the World War II airplane from Lake Washington, one of the guys we teamed up with to salvage 4 more of them, eventually did the SS New York, which was a pre-Civil War steamship that was found in the Gulf of Mexico. Or should I say that, Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America? So he found it in the Gulf of something, and had a nice trove, about $2,500 face value of coins that was basically the ship's money that they found in that ship, and had some nice coins in there pre-Civil War. We're going to do the whole project on an archaeological basis. We're going to actually try to disturb the ship itself as little as possible, just because it's a big undertaking. We believe now we have enough knowledge to know where the cargo is on board the ship, and it's located in the remains of the Wells Fargo Express room and in the ship's safe. And one of the bodies that was recovered from the ship had a receipt in it from the purser for considerable gold. And so we know that that was common practice. I mean, we speculate about this anyway, but it's always nice to have the actual evidence. That people would check their gold with the purser when they came on board because it wasn't really safe to keep in your cabin. And there's also treasure in the debris field as well. So there's a debris field that we figure is about 80,000 square meters. And sounds huge, but it's really not that, it takes about 20 days to process that. And we expect to find pokes of gold, in the debris field. We've actually made simulated pokes of gold with tungsten and have dropped them in various conditions to see how far they sink into the bottom, and it turns out really they don't sink into the bottom very far. We expect to find coins and other, artifacts, shallow in the mud, just in the debris field around the wreck. Am I going backwards here? All right, so let's talk about what's on board the ship. The coins, the gold bars, the gold dust. So we know that there's an insured shipment on board the vessel for $78,801. The Wells Fargo agent was also transporting $500,000 in gold dust, from the Cassiar gold field. And that was the gold that he brought down from Wrangell, Alaska. And when I first started, doing my research, I found, statements that say, oh, there's $100,000 in extra gold. There's $200,000 in extra gold. There's $300,000 in extra gold. And finally I found this one that says there's $500,000 in gold. I'm like, where's all this gold coming from? How does this work? Is this really accurate? Is this really on board the ship? And I'll talk about more of that in a couple minutes. There were also mill owners and merchants and wealthy individuals on board. There was a captain who had sold his steamship line for $40,000 in specie, and he was on board the ship. There was a memoir written in 1899 by the publisher of the local newspaper, and he was, friends with this particular guy. He was there when the luggage was brought to his cabin on board the ship, and he said that there wasn't like a heavy, valise or something else that the coins would have been in. So in 1875, the family of this person determined that the gold was on board the ship, and it was on board, is in the safe on the ship, and it went down with him. There were Chinese miners on board the ship. There was a big rate war between different steamship lines at the time, and so they would sell tickets to the ship to just anyone at sort of any price. And they sold tickets to a group of about 40 Chinese miners for $5 for passage to San Francisco. They said, well, there's just one slight problem. You don't get a cabin. You can just hang out on any place of the ship where you feel it's warm and dry. And so it was this group of Chinese miners that were on board that were traveling very inexpensively. And among them, the newspapers reported they had about $70,000 in gold. That gold we think was in their luggage. We don't think that they checked it with the purser. They probably wouldn't have felt that was safe. And they were last seen huddled around the smokestack, as the ship departed the surface. So when you add all this up, all the gold and everything on board the ship, it's about 734,000. There's some other people on board that probably had pretty large amounts of gold, but we don't actually have any solid evidence of that, so I don't put that in my estimates at all, just because we just don't have the facts. We have speculation, but not facts. So getting into the gold that was being transported by, I've got, 6 minutes left, is that right? Okay, 15 minutes left, but that's question and answer as well. Okay, I'll keep moving right along here. So the money that was being transported by Garesche was divided up among these banks. Again, Bank of British North America had an assay office, and so we believe that most of that gold was in gold bars. Again, this is where I started to get in these different newspaper accounts about the amount of gold on board. It kept getting bigger and bigger, and I'm like, well, where's this gold coming from? And it really came together when I found a diary that was written in 1878, 3 years after the ship sank. It was written in Tacoma, Washington, by the wife of Herbert Bancroft, and the library at UC Berkeley is named the Bancroft Library. He was an early historian of Pacific Northwest history. He and his wife would travel around and they would interview people about different things that they'd done. And they interviewed a guy named Arthur Vowell, and Arthur Vowell was the gold commissioner for the Cassiar Gold District prior to the gold commissioner who died on the ship. And so then he was also the predecessor. So he had intimate knowledge of the gold miners and the mining records. There was a small tax on the gold that was being shipped, and so he had an idea of what these guys were moving around. And in that interview, he said that some each possessed as much as $100,000 in gold as poor Sullivan went down. And that corroborates the information. And then again, I speculated, it's like, well, the only way this could really be true is if the gold came from 1874 and 1875. And then I found a newspaper article in the Alta newspaper in San Francisco, and it stated that a merchant up in Sitka, Alaska was regularly corresponding with the newspaper, and he said that of the miners that perished on the ship, when they left here in the spring of 1875, they left with $200,000, and then they mined for that season, and then they perished on the ship. And so when you kind of add all that up together, it's like, okay, yeah, this is a plausible story. We got evidence from 3 separate independent sources that say that gold was on board the ship. So this is kind of just a distribution of the gold that we know was in coins, most likely, for a number of prominent people that were on board the ship. And so we estimate that there's about $99,000 in gold coins on the ship. And the ratio that I used for gold bars to gold coins and stuff like that is similar to the Central America, which might not exactly equate, but it's better than just throwing a dart at the wall. So one of the things is like, well, the thing we hope for, of course, is lots of small gold bars. And so I found this photo. This is from Dawson, but it's also the Bank of British North America. And this is just a photo of the gold bars that they were, producing. And if you kind of sort through this, there's about 4 different sizes, 4 different molds that they had, including, these very large ones. I don't have anything for scale, so all I know is, if they kind of did the same thing 25 years later, maybe there's some small gold bars in the Pacific and some big gold bars. So this is, again, sort of the best evidence we have of how things were done at the Bank of British North America. Yeah, so this here is a picture of, this is the Bank of British North America right here. The Wells Fargo office was down the street here. This is Yates Street in Victoria. And this is what the scene looked like, just before they departed. This photo is actually from 1875. There's also one other assayer of gold bars. The British Columbian government made gold bars in the Caribou district for ease of transport. And so we expect on board the ship to find some from Bank of British North America and some gold bars from the assay office. We believe that the gold was transported in these standard Wells Fargo boxes. A number of these have survived, through the years. You can buy them from time to time. They were made by a manufacturer in San Francisco named Ayers, and those are the type of boxes that they used for the type of shipments that we had. They basically had two different sizes of boxes, and we believe that we will find some of these boxes still intact. Entirely possible. So the placer gold on the Pacific, it's interesting that some of the people that perished on the ship were also the people who found some of the largest nuggets in British Columbia. So people even then collected them, so it's possible that there's some decent sized nuggets on board the ship as well. And we sort of expect that some of the pokes that we find in the debris field will have some coins in them. This is just, again, more about the transport of gold from Victoria. Yeah, so again, this is where we came up with the ratio of the amount of gold coins that were in the bank shipments. It's just straight from the Central America. This is actually a picture of the safe from the Central America, which was found ejected from the ship. So when the ship hit the bottom, the safe was on the main deck, and the compression of the ship propelled it off into the debris field. When they opened it up, the main thing that they found in there were silver coins. And they figure it was mostly for pay for the crew. So I haven't really spent any time speculating on what sort of silver coins that we might find on the ship. No idea, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are some, again, maybe in relationship to paying the crew. So these are the amounts of deposits that the bank had in the 1875, in June of 1875, and it kind of gives you an idea that the bullion, they didn't have a lot, and they had a lot of coins. So it kind of leads you to believe that they're shipping large amounts, that maybe the amount of coins could actually be higher than we're thinking. But again, just speculation. These are some details about some of the other miners that were on board. There was a mill owner that was on board, and he was buying supplies for a whole season. And the interesting thing about that is that money would have been the money that was in circulation from his customers, and it would have an interesting cross-section of coins. There was a merchant from east of the mountains, the Cascades, and again, they had $3,000 on board. They would have an interesting collection of coins that they were taking in their money on board the ship. And so there is going to be, an interesting, cross-section of what was in circulation at the time in 1875. So, again, our best guess, 3,000 coins in the larger consignments, 2,000, coins in the smaller merchants, and then just small denominations that we'll find from all sorts of different sources. One conversation we had with a collector early on is he was asking about the ship's safe and the condition we expect to find that in. And we do know that our site is anoxic. And so during some of the sediment analysis that we've done, we discovered a little flake of brass, and it wasn't oxidized at all. And so we know that just a few inches below the surface, there is no oxygen. So is it possible that there's some paper documents in the safe, which was buried in the mud the day the ship sank? I don't know. It's a fun thing to think about. We will be very careful on how we recover that, and again, we're working with Bob Evans on that. Again, gold bars, we hope for a whole bunch of small gold bars, but who knows what the combination will end up. So again, we're recovering the precious cargo from 3 different areas: Wells Fargo Express Room, ship safe, and the debris field. So in conclusion, I believe that the Pacific contains one of the largest troves that will be discovered or is available of coins from this particular area, focused on 1875. I think it's unlikely that there's another trove out there that you would find that is as large. It's going to contain some very interesting gold bars from places that we don't have any gold bars, at least that's our belief. So Bank of British North America and the Government Assay Office, and maybe some others that we don't even know about. And it has a large amount of placer gold on board that we could do interesting things with, and hopefully there's some nice nuggets in there. All right, I think they're eyeing me to kick me out of here. Is that right? Okay, yeah, so I will be outside. I will answer any questions you guys have. I'll hang around as long as you want.